This is the fourth time I've tried to record this lecture, and I thought I just lost it again. All right, here we go. So you can imagine you're hiking, and if you do a lot of hiking around here, as I do, you often see sticks like this, and you often jump a little bit when you see them because they kind of look like snakes. And you'll notice that right after you jump, you look at it more closely, and most of the time it turns out to be a stick and not a snake. But you notice what your first reaction was. It was that jump. So in that time frame, you probably had a small sympathetic nervous system activation. Your heart rate might have increased. You might have sweated. All of the characteristics of sympathetic activation might have happened to you in that brief moment. And after that, you overrode the judgment. You looked at it more closely. You said, oh, it's just a stick. And your parasympathetic system kicked in, and all was well. Well, that is what we're talking about today, this relation between emotion in general and then our processing of that emotion, our expression of that emotion, and the actions we take based on that emotion, even how good we are at interpreting our own physiological responses. So, just as a quick overview, this is, of course, our brain, and we know that our limbic system contains one part of the brain, an organ called the amygdala, and that is active. It becomes red hot, active in response primarily to fear and also to other emotions. And so that's where the first emotion kicked in when we see the stick that looks like this. And after that, our brain, our prefrontal cortex especially, kicks in to override that judgment. There's a nice connection there between these two regions, and so the prefrontal cortex will override and say, no reason to be afraid, it's just a stick. And then our parasympathetic kicks in, and all is well. So that's generally how emotion happens. The emotional response is quicker than the cognitive response. So the main topics that we're going to cover, a couple of these I want you to get mostly from your book, and a couple of these I will be talking about a little bit in this video and then in class next week. So in your book, I'd like you to understand the difference between emotion and mood. Answer that question. What is the difference? How can you distinguish? In your book, I'd like you to understand the benefits of emotion, and the couple examples I've pointed out is justice and sympathy breakthroughs. What are meant by those terms? So look for that when you do your reading. Components of emotion we'll talk about a little bit more in here, but they do begin with an appraisal process, a stimulus to which we're responding, to which the emotion is elicited. The stimulus can be outside of ourselves, something that happens outside, or it can be just something we start thinking about, and then we appraise that and the emotion begins. You'll read more about this in your book. We have physiological responses. Our body does something. We express the emotion. Others can see it on our face or in our nonverbal actions. We interpret the physiological response. We decide, oh, I am angry, I am anxious. And finally, it leads us to take an action of some sort. So these main topics are covered. And finally, we'll come to that arrow in a moment. And finally, happiness psychology, what makes us happy. And so that'll be a component of our content this week that you'll be watching some really nice video on. So this arrow is pointing to these in red because we're going to spend a little more time on those. So in your prep this week, you'll be thinking about an emotion that you had and what it does in your body. So where do you feel it in your body? You'll be thinking about that. What do you notice in terms of your sympathetic nervous system when you're feeling that emotion? So I'm going to ask you to kind of identify that in yourself with an emotion that you experience frequently, and I am pointing you toward an adverse emotion. These are often pretty powerful and the ones often that we want to work through or find a way not to experience. So you'll be looking at that in your prep this week. Expressive behavior we'll spend some time on. We often communicate our own feelings much more truthfully through our nonverbal behavior and expressions, micro-expressions, than we do through our overt behaviors. And so that leads us to wonder, could lie detection work? Can we really read other people's emotions? Are we any good at this? And we'll be working with that a little bit in here, and you'll be reading about it and watching some video on it. And finally, our subjective feelings. If many individuals have the same physiological experience, let's say an increased heart rate, let's say a little bit of sweating or a little bit of a feeling of arousal, do they all interpret it the same way, or does one person interpret it as excitement while another interprets it as anxiety? So we'll be thinking about that question this week. You'll see I have some video clips. I hope to have time to share some of these with you. There's never enough time, but we'll see. Main researcher in this area is Dr. Paul Ekman. He's the guy we'll be spending some time with, at least his work. And he did a lot of work in things like microexpressions, Duchenne smiles. So he was trying to get at what people were really feeling, and he really scrutinized people's faces in order to learn about them. So we'll be working with those two ideas of his. He also found that some expressions are universal, and we can recognize them across cultures regardless of language. We recognize these same emotions in terms of what happens in the face. We'll be playing with that a little bit in class. And cultural specificity, there are some differences in cultures in terms of how facial expressions reflect emotion. So the Duchenne smile is a real smile. And how do we know if it's a real smile? Well, a genuine smile involves both the eyes and the corners of the mouth. So if it's a real smile, we would see the zygomatic major muscles coming into play and causing the corners of the mouth to raise. That muscle is voluntary. We control it. The muscle that, according to Ekman's work, is involuntary is this orbicularis oculi, which raises the cheeks and produces crow's feet around the eye. So it's causing a little bit of wrinkles on the outside of the eye. It's involuntary, and that is a characteristic of a genuine smile, a Duchenne smile. An authentic smile has both muscles coming into play, but one we control, it's voluntary, the other we don't control. And so it's a real smile if these eyes come into play as well. Why is this the case? Different parts of the brain are involved in these two functions. So we know that the zygomatic major is controlled in the motor cortex, and we know that the orbicularis oculi is controlled by the limbic system, by the emotional center. And you'll be watching a little video on this, just a 3-minute video in conjunction with your prep this week. And people, so how do we know this? Well, we know that if someone has hemispheric motor damage, which is what I was saying related to deliberate movement, if you ask them to smile, they get an asymmetric smile, a smile only on half of their face. But if they laugh genuinely, if they really find something funny, they'll get a full smile, which means that they have an involuntary control as well as a voluntary control over the capacity to smile. In people with damage to their anterior cerebral cortex in the left hemisphere, which is related to emotion, so they have damage there. So emotion is a little messed up. If they attempt to smile, they don't get asymmetry, but they'll get that asymmetry in a spontaneous smile, the smile that emerges from the emotional center. So those are just some of the ways that we know that this Duchenne smile involving both of those muscles is at play here. And you can see some examples of the Duchenne and the non-Duchenne smile, the real smile, where we see both of them have the uplifted mouth, the voluntary control of the zygomatic, but only this one has the involvement of the eyes. We can see some involvement of the eyes here in this smile, a genuine smile it appears to be. We can see we don't have too much eye involvement here. This is like what you do for your passport photo. And we see some more examples. And you'll be, for your prep, getting some photos of a couple people, and I've given you some prompts to tell them. So I'm hoping if you can get permission to share a couple photos like that, that's great. If not, you'll just have to write about them, but I hope you can all bring in a couple photos. And some more examples here. Microexpression, another aspect of Ekman's work, are tiny little movements. The definition is an innate result of a voluntary and an involuntary emotional response occurring simultaneously and conflicting with one another. So we have someone who knows the socially appropriate response and offers it, but then inside there had a different result. Maybe a repulsion came in, and it comes into play really quick, microseconds, less than a second, partial seconds. It comes in as a flicker across someone's face as they're doing what is the socially appropriate thing to do. And usually it's an emotion that the one that flicks across the face is the emotion that someone doesn't want to publicly convey because it's either socially inappropriate or undesirable, or it's something they wanted to hide. And so the ability of us to begin to identify microexpressions leads a little bit to people thinking that they can detect lies, because we would see these microexpressions that would reveal the lie. And so I've asked you to do a little work with that this week. I'm not sure if this prompt will work, but I'm asking you to tell a lie. And you'll see the description in your prep. And then and make a video of yourself telling that lie. And then to watch a short video clip, it's sort of popular media clip saying this is how you can tell if someone's lying, and see if you did any of those characteristics. And we'll talk about lie detection a little bit more in class as well. We'll also be playing with this in class. So that's the main content related to expressive emotion. You can see these universal emotions are the ones that are identified by Ekman as crossing cultures and languages, always the same emotion and the same characteristics. And again, these are all micro-expressions too, like the characteristics of the surprise include the raised eyebrows, include the drop to jaw, but we'll play around with making these expressions as well and see how it makes us feel. So we'll take a look at these universal emotions. And you'll be reading about exceptions to these when you do your class next week. Interestingly, my son was trying to persuade me that these little emojis we put in actually communicate better on a text message than writing something out, and I find that kind of interesting. I think he may be onto something there. So how do emotions impact our relationships? So we think about they might promote commitment. The hormone oxytocin might go along with an emotion and allow us to read the emotions of others and set aside our own interest and act in the interest of someone else. So that's one way. You'll read more about this. Secondly, let's see, I guess I was going to speak about this here. We do know that also we can coordinate our actions. Let me just see if, yeah, there we go. I'm going to come to that red box in a moment here. We also think about flirtation, like if you're interested in somebody in a relationship, what are you displaying nonverbally? We'll look more at that in chapter 10, but that is covered a little bit in this chapter as well. And then motivating controlled action. So coordinated action, I read quite a bit about a SEAL squad. The SEALs are a very elite branch of the military. It's very selective in who they take, and the training is quite rigorous because they do very dangerous missions. And one aspect of the training that I read about in the book involves something that they can't train, and it's this ability to be in emotional synchrony with the group. And so if they're on a covert mission in the dark, they talk about some sort of a capacity, a synchrony among them that surpasses language, and it seems to be an emotional connection on the squad. And that's the one thing they can't test for when they recruit candidates. And the book was describing that candidates either seem to have the ability to sync with the group emotionally or not. And it's a make or break for the SEALs. So they have to have people who can do this. I suspect athletic teams are a little bit like this too. They get into that synchrony. So you'll read a little bit more about that. And then emotional intelligence. It's called your EQ. It's a lot of work by Daniel Goleman, if you're familiar with him. And this is the skill with which individuals navigate the verbal and nonverbal social terrain. So how good are you at going into a room where you're to speak, say, for example, or where you make connections and reading the mood of the room, reading the feeling of the room and adjusting your behaviors accordingly. So that's called your EQ, and we'll talk about that a little, but you'll definitely be reading about it. Emotions and social cognition, we'll talk about how do our emotions influence our perceptions and reasoning. So our emotions influence our perceptions. It's something that is not scary. So for example, I made the mistake of watching something kind of scary when I was home alone a few days ago, and all of a sudden, and it was about some woman who had woken up with a man next to her bed. It turned out to be it was a documentary. I don't know why I had it on, but all of a sudden, things that are neutral looked fearful. Like my door with the security door, the big door open, but the security door closed and locked, that began to look scary and made me feel vulnerable. And like some car lights on the road all of a sudden looked ominous, because you know how it is when you watch a scary movie at night. So that fearful movie activated fear in me, and it made me perceive things that were neutral as frightening. So they influenced my perception of those, of a neutral situation. And that same happens for all of us. And I'm back to the snake again here. We'll cover the snake a lot. once you see the snake, once you actually see the snake, then you'll start to see the snake everywhere, right? If you actually see a snake out on the trail, all of a sudden everything you see looks like it's kind of dangerous. So yeah, that can happen to us in terms of many emotions, fear emotions, but also positive emotions, angry emotions. Emotions will influence our reasoning. If you have positive emotions, as in the happiness psychology, you might have certain kinds of creativity seem to burgeon. You'll read about the broaden and build hypothesis by Fredrickson. Take a look at what that is and see if you'll be able to explain it. Emotions influence our moral judgment. We often employ a social intuitions model of moral judgment, which means we're not always applying our cognition. We're relying more on intuitions, which is an interpretation of emotional responses. And you'll read about moral foundations theory, so see if you know what that's about. And I'll try to show this little video in class. I think you should know what the trolleyology prompt is. And hopefully we'll be able to have time to show this. I did post the video on D2L as well. So my hope is that we'll be able to get to a lot of this in class. And the final topic that you'll be working with is happiness. You'll be choosing one of two videos to watch. I'm asking you to watch for about an hour. I know that you know, if you don't get through the whole thing, that's fine, but try to watch at least an hour of the one you choose. Then we'll talk in that content about how we measure happiness. Usually it's through life satisfaction question, how well is your life going? Or emotional well-being, if someone tends to experience more positive than negative emotion. Affective forecasting, you'll read in your book that we're not really that good at knowing what makes us happy. And a couple of the reasons are immune neglect, underestimate our own resilience. We think we're going to be unhappy for a much longer time than we are if, say, our boyfriend breaks up with us or if something bad happens. And focalism, we overfocus on the searing pain, but really that is a relatively short-lived part of a painful experience. So those are a couple of errors that we make in causing us to not be very good at affective forecasting. This word affective, remember, that's that unusual word in psychology. We also have the word affect, but this is affect, which just refers to emotion. That's it. We'll talk about pursuing happiness, how giving versus receiving can actually generate more happiness, how experiences versus possessions can generate more happiness. So keep that in mind when you do your birthday shopping or holiday shopping. Recalling our happy moments can be very beneficial for overall happiness. Maslow writes about peak experiences, which are experiences that seem to produce an elation beyond a normal happiness, a happiness that seems above. But other researchers also point out that when the timing of these peak experiences, like if we go to do something really scary, like we're going to go rock climbing for the first time, there's going to be a lot of fear and probably anxiety or negative emotion if you're a little afraid of the experience. And maybe there's going to be muscle tension that's going to be difficult as you're climbing. But once you get to the top, you're going to have like a peak experience. You'll have achieved that, and that will give you like a recency effect, and you'll forget all the pain that you went through. Giving birth to a baby, for some women, it happens that as soon as they hold that baby in their arms, almost the whole labor is blocked out. They don't remember it. So that can happen, and that can promote happiness. And duration neglect, it doesn't really matter how long it lasted. The peak experience can be short relative to the painful experience. And if the peak experience was really good and recent, that might overcome or surpass. And Nirvana and the Brain, you'll read that section, talks about how we can go inward and escape all of this pleasure followed by pain, followed by pleasure, followed by pain, and find a place of prolonged peace. And we'll be watching a nice little TED Talk by Mathieu Ricard about this state and how it relates to happiness. We could spend a whole semester talking about this topic. It's one of my favorite content areas. But we can't, so I'll try and narrow it down. I've got quite a lot to share with you this week, and I hope you enjoy this content. You should plan on a couple hours of work for getting your prep ready, because I've asked you to do some things for it. So you'll have to watch the video and get in touch with a couple people, so don't wait till the last minute on that. All right, see you next week in class.